I have spent the last 12 years building walls. Not stone walls, but digital ramparts that protect the life savings of over 4 million people. As the lead cybersecurity architect at Fintech Global, I was the ghost in the machine. I worked in the shadows 12 hours a day, coding the black box, a proprietary encryption protocol that made our company unhackable. I didn't have a fancy title, and I didn't want one. I had a quiet office, a massive salary, and $5 million worth of stock options that were set to vest the day our company went public. That IPO was supposed to be my retirement, the reward for a decade of missed birthdays, cold dinners, and endless lines of code. Everything changed when the founder retired and his nephew, Julian, was appointed as the new CTO. Julian was the type of person who thought the cloud was literally something in the sky. He had an MBA from a school his father donated a library to, and he carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no. He hated me from the moment we met. I was the only person in the building who didn't laugh at his jokes or pretend that his innovative ideas for using AI to pick office snacks were genius. 2 weeks before the IPO, the biggest day in the company's history, Julian called me into his glass-walled office. He wasn't alone. A woman from HR and a private security guard were standing there. Julian didn't look up from his phone. "We're making some changes," he said, his voice dripping with fake empathy. "We've decided to move the security department in a more agile direction. Your services are no longer required." I felt the air leave my lungs. "My stock options vest in 10 days, Julian. If you're firing me now, you're essentially stealing $5 million from me." Julian finally looked up, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Actually, we're firing you for cause. We've conducted an internal audit and found irregularities in your access logs. We're classifying it as attempted corporate espionage. Not only do you lose your options, but if you even think about hiring a lawyer, we'll hand this file over to the FBI. However," he leaned forward, "if you hand over the master encryption keys right now and sign this NDA, we might decide to just let you walk away quietly. Think of it as a mercy." I looked at the HR rep. She looked at her shoes. I looked at the guard. He was just doing his job. I looked back at Julian. He thought he had me cornered. He thought that because I was a nerd who lived in the terminal, I would be terrified of his legal threats. What he didn't understand was that I had built the black box to be intelligent. It didn't just protect against hackers, it protected against people exactly like him. "You want the keys, Julian?" I asked, my voice steady, my mind already calculating the variables. "You can have them. But once I walk out that door, the system is yours. Completely. I won't be able to help you when the protocols start their automatic validation cycles." Julian laughed, a sharp, arrogant sound. "We have a dozen junior devs who can handle your cycles. Just give us the password and get out." I sat down at his desk, typed out the 64-character alphanumeric string, a string that looked like a master key but was actually a trigger for a recursive security audit, and handed him the paper. Julian grabbed it like it was a winning lottery ticket. As I was escorted out of the building with my single box of belongings, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was about to happen. In exactly 6 hours, the black box would notice that its creator had been purged from the employee database, and it would do exactly what it was programmed to do: protect the assets at all costs. The rain wasn't just falling, it was punishing the pavement as I walked away from the Fintech Global headquarters. My box was getting soaked, but I didn't care. My mind was back in the server room, visualizing the code I had lived with for over a decade. Julian thought he had inherited a gold mine. What he didn't realize was that he had just grabbed the handle of a live grenade with the pin already pulled. The 64-character string I gave him wasn't a master key in the traditional sense. In the world of high-level cybersecurity, we use something called heartbeat verification. The system, the black box, was programmed to check for my biometric signature and my unique developer hardware ID every 6 hours. It was a failsafe I designed after a minor hacking attempt 3 years ago. If the system didn't detect me, the authorized architect, it would assume the core had been compromised by an insider threat. I took the bus home, sat in my small apartment, and opened a bag of cheap chips. I wasn't going to hack them. I didn't need to. I was simply going to let my creation do exactly what I had spent millions of the company's dollars training it to do: defend itself. At exactly 10 p.m., the first heartbeat check would fail. Back at the office, I could imagine the scene. Julian was likely popping champagne with his hand-picked yes men, bragging about how he had trimmed the dead weight and saved the company millions in stock options just before the IPO. He probably had the 64-character key framed on his desk. He didn't understand that the moment he entered that key, he initiated a root-level audit. The system was now scanning every single line of code, looking for the person who entered the key. Since Julian's credentials weren't in the architect tier, the black box began to slowly, methodically, encrypt its own command and control layers to prevent what it perceived as an unauthorized takeover. By 10:15 p.m., my phone, which was still linked to the public status dashboard of the company, a page anyone could see, started blowing up with service unavailable alerts. The first to go was the International Payment Gateway, then the customer login portal. To the outside world, it looked like a standard server hiccup. To me, it was the sound of the first domino falling. I checked the live stock market forums. Since the IPO was only days away, investors were watching fintech global like hawks. A 30-minute outage at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday wasn't a tragedy, but it was a crack in the armor. I sat in the dark, the blue light of my monitor reflecting in my glasses, watching the billions lost counter in my head start to tick. Julian had stolen my $5 million in options. By the time this was over, I was going to make sure that $5 million looked like pocket change compared to what he was about to lose. The beauty of it? I hadn't broken a single law. I hadn't deleted a single file. I had simply stopped being there to tell the system that everything was okay. And in the world of automated finance, if the system thinks something is wrong, it doesn't ask questions. It shuts the door and bolts it from the inside. By midnight, the status dashboard was no longer just flickering. It was a sea of crimson. Every major node in the fintech global network was flatlining. In my apartment, I sat in my ergonomic chair, the only light coming from the 3 monitors that had been my life for 12 years. I wasn't hacking. I was simply observing the public-facing API responses. Each error 503 was a symphony. Each connection timed out was a verse in the requiem of Julian's career. I knew exactly what was happening in the war room at headquarters. I could almost smell the ozone from the overheating servers and the stale coffee of panicked junior developers. Julian would have called in his Agile team, a group of 20-somethings who were great at making pretty apps, but had never seen the inside of a hardened encryption kernel. They would be staring at the black box interface, seeing a wall of scrolling hexadecimal code that made no sense to them. They would try to force restart the servers. That was their first fatal mistake. I had programmed the black box with a state persistence protocol. If the power was cut or the system was rebooted during an unauthorized audit, it assumed a physical breach was in progress. The response? It began to move the core database into a cold storage vault, an encrypted partition that required a physical hardware key that was currently sitting in my pocket, disguised as a keychain. I remember a moment from 3 years ago when the previous CEO asked me why I built such aggressive fail-safes. I told him, "In finance, trust is a house of glass. If one person throws a stone from the inside, the whole thing has to lock down before the glass hits the floor." He understood. Julian didn't. Julian likely thought he could just patch the problem. I watched the traffic logs. They were trying to bypass the encryption layer. It was like trying to bypass the vacuum of space to get to the moon. Every failed attempt triggered a penalty delay. First, the system slowed down by 10%, then 20%. By 2 a.m., the transaction processing speed of a billion-dollar company was slower than a 1990s dial-up modem. Every second that passed, the company was hemorrhaging money. In the world of high-frequency trading and fintech, millisecond delays equal millions of dollars in lost slippage and canceled orders. But the financial loss was only half the story. The real nightmare for Julian was the regulatory trigger. Because the system was in lockdown mode, it automatically sent a Tier 1 alert to the SEC and the banking regulators, stating that the integrity of the financial ledger cannot be verified. This is the nuclear option. It meant that, by law, the company had to halt all operations until an independent audit could be performed. I imagined Julian screaming at the junior devs, his $3,000 suit drenched in sweat, his expensive cologne replaced by the scent of pure, unadulterated fear. He had promised the board a flawless IPO. He had promised them that I was expendable. Now, the very code he tried to steal was systematically dismantling his reputation. I pulled up a specialized investor forum. The rumors were already spreading. Fintech Global has a major breach, one user wrote. The IPO is dead, said another. The pre-market valuation was already cratering. The $5 million in options he stole from me? At this rate, they would be worth less than the paper they were printed on by Sunrise. And I hadn't even started my second phase of the plan. I was just letting the clock tick. At 3:15 a.m., my personal phone rang. No caller ID, I let it ring. At 3:17 a.m., it rang again. I picked it up but didn't say a word. Hello? Hello? Mark? Is that you? Julian's voice was unrecognizable. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a high-pitched, frantic tremor. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a roof. I remained silent. I could hear the background noise of the war room, phones ringing, people shouting, the frantic clicking of keyboards. Mark, listen, Julian continued, his breath coming in short gasps. We're having a small technical glitch. The team says there's some kind of loop in the encryption kernel. Since you wrote the original draft, we thought you might want to consult. Purely as a freelance basis, of course. A small glitch, Julian? I finally spoke, my voice calm and clinical. The public API says your entire European and Asian clusters are offline. The SEC has likely already flagged your ledger as unverified. That's not a glitch. That's a total systemic collapse. Look, I don't have time for a lecture, Julian snapped, a flash of his old self returning before quickly vanishing. The board is calling an emergency session in 4 hours. The IPO is in jeopardy. Just tell us how to bypass the heartbeat check. I'll make sure your final paycheck is processed immediately. I leaned back, looking out at the rain-slicked streets of the city. My final paycheck was already processed, Julian. You fired me for cause, remember? You accused me of corporate espionage. Why would you want the help of a criminal? Mark, please. He was almost whispering now. I'll give you the bonus. I'll double it. Just give us the bypass code. It doesn't work like that, I said. The black box is in integrity lockdown. There is no bypass code. The only way to restore the system is a full manual re-authentication from a trusted architect terminal. And as you pointed out, I no longer have a badge, a laptop, or a job. In fact, if I were to touch the system now, I would be committing the very crime you accused me of. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Julian knew he was trapped. He had tried to play a game of power in a world ruled by logic, and he had lost. What do you want? He asked, his voice dead. I don't want your bonus, Julian, and I don't want a consultation fee. I want a full public retraction of the for-cause termination. I want my stock options fully vested and moved to a private brokerage. And I want a signed confession sent to the board of directors, admitting that you ordered the termination to seize my assets and that you directed the unauthorized attempt to breach the encryption core. That's career suicide, Julian yelled. And what you did to me wasn't, I replied. You have 3 hours and 45 minutes before the board meeting. Every minute you wait, another $50 million of the company's valuation evaporates. Tick-tock, Julian. I hung up. I knew he wouldn't do it. Not yet. He still thought he could find a way out. He still thought money or influence could override a if-then-else statement. He was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. Code doesn't care who your uncle is. Code only cares if the parameters are met. And right now, the parameters for Julian's survival were looking very, very thin. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting a cold, gray light over the city. While most people were waking up to their morning coffee, the board of directors at Fintech Global was witnessing the digital equivalent of a nuclear meltdown. I was monitoring the dark web forums and private investor channels. The panic had moved from technical glitch to existential threat. The pre-market trading for the company's existing private shares had hit a circuit breaker. The price was falling so fast that the system had to freeze trading to prevent a total wipeout. At 7 a.m., the emergency board meeting commenced. I wasn't in the room, but I knew the players. These were billionaires who valued stability above all else. Julian would be standing at the head of the table, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling as he tried to explain why the agile team he promised could replace me had spent the last 8 hours making the problem 10 times worse. He would try to lie. He would say it was a coordinated external attack. But the black box was already one step ahead of him. Part of the lockdown protocol I wrote included an automatic transparency log. Since the system could no longer verify the internal architect, it began emailing a summarized report of all system activities directly to the board's audit committee. They weren't seeing an external attack, they were seeing a log of Julian's own credentials attempting to force bypass security protocols. They were seeing a record of his failed master key entry. Every lie he told in that boardroom was being contradicted in real time by the very system he claimed to be fixing. I received a text from a former colleague who was still in the office, hiding in the break room. "It's a massacre," it read. "Julian tried to blame you, but the chairman interrupted him and read a system log out loud that showed Julian personally authorized the lockout. They've called in the FBI's cyber division. They think it's an inside job. By Julian." That was the nuclear part of the plan. By accusing me of espionage, Julian had set a legal precedent. Now, when the system failed and showed him as the primary actor, the FBI wasn't looking at the fired nerd. They were looking at the arrogant CTO who seemed to be intentionally sabotaging his own company to hide something. The irony was poetic. The more he tried to fix the code without me, the more he looked like a criminal to the federal agents now standing in the server room. I sat on my balcony, watching the city wake up. My phone buzzed again. It was a formal email from the chairman of the board. No freelance talk this time, no consultation. It was a plea. They had realized that the Aegis core wasn't just code, it was a locked vault, and I was the only person with the combination. They offered me everything I asked for, the retraction, the options, a massive promotion, and the immediate termination of Julian. But I knew the game wasn't over. Julian was a cornered rat, and cornered rats tend to bite. He had one last move, a desperate attempt to delete the entire database before I could get back in. What he didn't know was that the database was already gone, tucked away in a virtual space he couldn't even see. By 10 a.m., the headquarters was no longer a place of business. It was a crime scene. As I walked toward the entrance, I saw the black SUVs parked at the curb. I wasn't wearing a suit. I was in my usual hoodie and jeans, carrying a specialized encrypted laptop that the board had practically begged me to bring. The security guards who had escorted me out 2 days ago now stood aside, their heads low, refusing to meet my eyes. I was led directly to the server room. The air was frigid, the fans of the cooling units screaming at maximum velocity. There stood Julian, flanked by 2 men in suits with FBI embroidered on their windbreakers. He looked like he had aged 20 years. His suit was wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and he was shouting at the agents. "He did this! He's the one! He's the architect! He's sabotaging us!" One of the agents, a man with a face like granite, turned to me. "Are you the lead architect?" I nodded. "Can you tell us what's happening here?" I didn't look at Julian. I opened my laptop and plugged it into the emergency maintenance port. The system detected an unauthorized attempt to seize control using high-level administrative keys. It followed its standard security protocol to protect the financial integrity of 4 million clients. It's currently in stasis mode. "He gave me the keys!" Julian screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He gave me the password." "I gave you the emergency audit key, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the cold room. "As I told you, it's only to be used in the event of a total disaster. You used it to try and bypass my biometric checks so you could seize my stock options before the IPO. The system saw that as a hostile takeover. It did exactly what it was designed to do." The FBI agent looked at Julian, then back at my screen. I showed him the logs, the timestamps of my termination, the timestamps of Julian's failed login attempts, and the record of the for-cause firing that had no supporting evidence. The narrative Julian had built was crumbling in real time. He hadn't just fired an employee. He had attempted to hijack a regulated financial system. "Julian Marcus," the agent said, his voice cold and final. "We're going to need you to come with us for questioning regarding the intentional disruption of a protected financial network and potential securities fraud." "You can't do this," Julian yelled as they began to lead him away. "I'm the CTO. My uncle owns—" "Your uncle just resigned from the board, Julian," the chairman said, walking into the room. "And the company is currently filing a civil suit against you for the loss of $800 million in market capitalization. You're done." As they dragged Julian out, the room fell into a heavy, respectful silence. The board members looked at me with a mix of fear and desperation. The company was on the brink of total collapse. The IPO was canceled, the regulators were in the building, and the system was still locked. They didn't just want me back, they needed me to perform a miracle. I looked at the flickering red lights on the server racks. I could fix it. I could bring the black box back to life in 10 minutes. But first, I had to make sure the lines were drawn correctly. I turned to the chairman. "I'll restore the system. But the new contract won't be for an employee. I'm a partner now. And my first act as partner is to double the security budget and move our servers to a location Julian's family can't even find on a map." He didn't even hesitate. He shook my hand. I sat down at the terminal, entered my true biometric key, and watched as the red lights slowly, one by one, turned back to a steady, rhythmic green. The ghost was back in the machine. The restoration of the Aegis system was like watching a dying city flicker back to life. As my fingers danced across the mechanical keys, entering the master override sequences that only I knew, the red warnings on the monitors dissolved into a steady, rhythmic green. The payment gateways opened, the European logistics clusters resynchronized, and the global ledger began to process the backlog of transactions. To the board of directors standing behind me, it looked like magic. To me, it was just the natural order of things being restored. The fallout, however, was anything but quiet. The planned IPO, the event that Julian was so desperate to protect while he stole my shares, was officially postponed for 6 months. In the financial world, a postponement is often a death sentence for momentum. The company's valuation didn't just drop, it evaporated. By the time the markets closed that Friday, Fintech Global had lost over $800 million in projected market cap. Julian's efficiency had cost the company nearly $1 billion. But Julian's problems were far more personal, because he had used his administrative access to try and bypass security during a sensitive pre-IPO period. The SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, launched a full-scale investigation into market manipulation. The FBI's cyber division kept his master keynote as evidence. They argued that his actions were a deliberate attempt to sabotage the company's security to facilitate a fraudulent takeover of employee assets. Julian didn't just lose his job, he was banned for life from serving as an officer in any publicly traded company. His Ivy League reputation was scorched earth. I heard through the grapevine that his wealthy family refused to pay for his high-end legal defense after the board threatened to sue them directly for the losses caused by their nephew's appointment. I, on the other hand, walked back into my office on Monday morning with a new title: Chief Technology Officer. The board didn't just give me my vested options, they granted me an additional 2% of the company as a stability retention bonus. My $5 million retirement fund had effectively doubled even with the lower stock price. But more importantly, I had total autonomy. My first act was to fire the agile team that Julian had hired and replace them with the veteran engineers he had planned to let go. We rebuilt the black box into something even more robust, a system that now requires a 3-factor hardware authentication, one of which is permanently held by a third-party legal escrow. Sometimes, late at night, when the office is quiet and the servers are humming their low electric song, I think about that rainy afternoon when I was escorted out by security. I think about the smug look on Julian's face when he told me I was expendable. People often think that in the world of big business, the ones with the loudest voices and the most expensive suits hold the power. They are wrong. In the digital age, power doesn't belong to the one who owns the building. It belongs to the one who knows how the locks work. I'm no longer the ghost in the machine. I am the architect of the machine itself. And as for Julian, last I heard, he was working for a low-level insurance firm in a city far away, banned from touching anything more complex than a basic spreadsheet. Every time he sees a server error 404 or a password prompt, I hope he remembers the 64-character string I gave him. I hope he remembers that while you can fire a person, you can never fire the truth of their work. The lines have been redrawn, the system is secure, and for the first time in 12 years, the black box is perfectly balanced.